Hey there! So, with everything that's happening in the world at the moment, I wanted to make a slightly different kind of video this time. I want to tell you a story. A true story. A travel story. Something that happened to me. But before we get there, we need a bit of a lead up to sort of understand where we're gonna land. There's an experience that every traveler will get once you've seen enough places. Inevitably, at some point or another, one of these places you've been to where you've had amazing memories and experiences, where you've met incredible people, you'll see a news report or a post or something on social media. You'll see something terrible has happened to that place. This might be a terrorist attack or a natural disaster or a war. For example, in 2019, mid-2019, I was fortunate enough to visit Ukraine. I was able to explore Kyiv with a bunch of other people, and it was such a pretty city. It was so lovely, and the people there, I spent an afternoon just wandering the city with some of the locals that I met in a bakery, I think, and it was just so nice. It was amazing. And they had these monuments, sort of displays set up around town, especially in the main sort of square area, commemorating the 2014 revolution that they'd had. Basically where they'd kicked out the Russian-controlled president, prime minister, leader. They kicked out the Russian-connected guy because they wanted to be more connected to the EU. They wanted to move in that direction, which is something that has slowly led to the current war that has been going on for something like over a year now. And I know that with everything that's happened in the war there, I'm almost certain most of what I saw in Kyiv and Ukraine isn't there anymore. I'm certain that some of the people I met there are not in Ukraine anymore, and I hope they're safe. And just to be clear, you do not need travel to feel empathy. Travel does not make you better or anything like that. All it does is make the stories more personal to you, in the same way that stories do. They help you breed empathy. They are not required to breed empathy, but they do help, which is why we tell stories in the first place. But this video is not about Ukraine, though it easily could be. This video is about Palestine. And earlier that year, January 2019, I was fortunate enough to visit the West Bank of Palestine. And I want to tell you about the day I had there. So for those who are unaware of how Palestine works, Palestine is split into two basic sections. You've got Gaza, which is more or less an open-air prison at this point. That's where most of the horrible things happen. And then over by Jerusalem, you have the West Bank, which is a much larger area and butts up against the western bank of the River Jordan, hence the name, the West Bank. The West Bank is where basically most of the touristy section is. That's where I was. I was in the touristy section. I was not in Gaza. Not many people get to go to Gaza because Israel doesn't like that, and it is very heavily secured, shall we say? Is secured the right word? Protected is not the right word. Locked down. It is very heavily locked down. Most of the horrible things you hear about happening in Palestine happen in Gaza. Whereas the West Bank, the reason that's far more touristy is because that's where most of the holy sites, especially for Christianity, are. If they're not in Jerusalem, then you have Bethlehem, the River Jordan, all these places where the stories that we all hear about growing up in predominantly Christian cultures, all those stories happen in the West Bank, more or less. So I visited Jerusalem because I grew up as a bit of a medieval history nut, and Jerusalem is one of the centers of European and world history for thousands of years. So many religions center around this one place, which causes a lot of political issues. And if you're into medieval history like I was growing up, a big part of that is the Crusades, for good or ill, and this is the place that everyone was fighting over. This is the one spot that everything happened. So I wanted to see that, and it was absolutely an intense and eye-opening experience. I had never been to the Middle East before. That was my first sort of dipping my toes in the water. And yeah, it's an intense place. It's an amazing place. It is a fascinating place. Walking through the Armenian quarters and Christian quarter and Muslim quarter and Jewish quarter, seeing things change but not change, seeing the, I believe it's the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, where 6 different religions or variations on religions all sort of control this one incredibly holy place, and every one of them has to agree for anything to change. And as a result, there is a ladder that is outside one of the windows that was left there a few hundred years ago by a worker painting or something. And because nothing can happen if everyone doesn't agree, no one can agree whether or not they can move the ladder. Therefore, the ladder has stayed there for hundreds of years. Not many places on Earth can have that kind of ridiculousness. And it's kind of funny if it wasn't absolutely tragic when you realize that ladder, even though it's a symbol of this kind of ridiculousness that happened there, so are all the graves. Because fighting over that ladder is the exact same problem on a lesser and sort of silly scale as the literal crusades and Israel versus Palestine. All of this, they're all fighting over the same things because no one can agree. Everyone wants to be top dog. But I digress. The hostel that I was staying at was outside of the old part of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has a big wall that was built a few hundred years ago, 500 years ago. Inside of that is all of the things that you imagine of as Jerusalem. Outside of that, you have the suburbs, business districts, all that kind of stuff. I was staying in a hostel outside of it, not far of a walk. But the hostel had day tours, as many hostels do, and one of the day tours took you through the West Bank, Palestine, which is not as easy a place to get to on your own. So I thought, yes, I'll take this tour. It was an all-day tour. You get up in the morning, get on a bus, and go and experience the West Bank. And with everything happening in the world at the moment, especially in Palestine, especially in Gaza, where we were not, I wanted to talk about our tour guide that day, because he was kind of incredible. Now, I'm not going to give you his name, and I have some photos of him, and I'm not going to show those photos, because I don't know if anything I say here is going to get him in trouble, and I don't want to risk that. He is too cool of a guy to risk that, and I have no contact with him, so if you see this, you are awesome. So I'm going to call him Sam. Sam is not his name. I just watched Lord of the Rings recently. Now, Sam was a Palestinian. He was a Christian Palestinian, in the same way that Jewish or Muslim in that part of the world can be seen of as a racial group. Christians can be seen as a racial group as well. They are quite a minority there, and are not treated greatly, but that might have more been the Palestine thing, I'm not entirely sure. And as the bus took us through into the West Bank of Palestine, he explained what we would see. So for the record, I am not Christian myself, but I grew up in Christian Eurocentric society, so you get taught all the stories in school as you grow up. To the point that if I mention the name Noah or Noah's Ark, basically everyone here knows what I mean by that, except in Palestine the story is slightly different. Not in obvious ways, but he would, as we're driving through the desert, he would say, oh yes, so you know the story of Noah's Ark, the ark that the world flooded for 40 days and 40 nights, and he landed upon a mountaintop until the waters slowly receded. That mountaintop was there. And he would point out the window, and he'd say, yes, you see that little mountain with a little church at the top? That's where the ark landed. It's a very weird place, especially if you have grown up in a Christian-centric society. Suddenly all those stories become a lot more tangible. So he would tell us stories like that. Stories like part of the way that the Jesus myth works is that Mary and Joseph turn up to an inn and they are shunned away. They must go be with the animals. And that's why baby Jesus was born in a manger, something something. Except in his version, he explained why that might be. Because the town, supposedly at the time, was absolutely packed. And so the tavern, the inn, hotel, whatever you would call that, was absolutely full. And Mary was very, very pregnant. she was about to give birth, as she did a few hours later. And there was a part of practices at the time where you do not give birth in a crowded room. You keep the pregnant woman away in the same way that we do with hospitals. You need a clean, warm area. You need space to give birth. You don't want to do it in a room packed with men. And the way that their buildings worked is it gets quite cold at night in the desert, so you keep all the animals at the back of essentially a cave. And the back, which was the warmest, is where you keep the animals, because they're your money, basically, and then the people live up front so they can come and go as they please. So in his version of the story, she wasn't turned away, she was moved to the back with the animals because it was warmer there, because there was space, because you need to do that if a woman is pregnant and about to give birth. You need space, you need warmth, you need as much as you can to make this birth successful. Also, keep in mind, giving birth was incredibly dangerous at this time. It's still very dangerous, but dying in childbirth, or the child dying in childbirth, very common at this point. So that's why a lot of these practices happen. His version had her not ejected, but protected, which is quite interesting. And he'd tell us the stories, he'd take us through these places and explain these things. And then he would also point out houses we drove past, little settlements, which are not legally there. And he would never pass judgment. He would never say, this thing is bad. He would simply say, certain countries do not believe those should be there. And then he would point out the walls we drove past and say, these are dividing families. People cannot cross these walls. And we'd go through checkpoints. And it became very obvious that those checkpoints were not for us. We were the tourists, we were money, basically, going through here. The checkpoints were for him. He was the only one that had to be controlled, because this is an apartheid state. Those walls are to keep him in line. Those checkpoints are to make sure he stays in line, along with all of his family and friends and people, to keep the Palestinians in line. And bear in mind, this was the touristy section. One thing I noticed as he was speaking, as he had a grin wider than his face, he was a very lovely man. You could tell that he was not saying certain things, because in some ways his safety relied upon not saying certain things, simply letting us make our own choices. And on one of the stories he told, we went to the River Jordan, which is supposedly where Jesus was first baptized. And a lot of people go there to get baptized themselves in this holy place, which is somewhat hilarious because the water is filthy. So this river, the River Jordan, is the border between Palestine and Jordan next to it. And so from the Palestinian side, you can see Jordan, you can see buildings, and there's always guards there because they don't want people crossing either way. But you can get into the water and you can see the other side. And he told us this story of a previous tour that he'd done, where there was a family. They were a Palestinian family. They'd earned up enough money and they'd met him in Palestine and just sort of, they wanted to go on a tour of their own country. And they kept saying to him, hey, we need to be at the Jordan River at whatever time, 3 o'clock. And he kept saying, oh, no, we'll try, and whatever happens, happens. And they would say, no, we need to be there at 3 o'clock. And he would say, whoa, okay, we'll do our best. We'll do what we can. And they get there, and the family immediately runs to the river, just bolts, and starts screaming, and not sad, but like joyously, hey, there you are, like laughing. And on the other side is another family, except it's not another family. It's a bunch of Palestinian refugees who cannot get back into Palestine, but they can get into Jordan. And those refugees on the other side are their brothers, sisters, cousins. It's the other half of the family, and this is the closest those two could ever get, was shouting across this river, how is school going? How is happy birthday for last week, I'm sorry we couldn't get in contact. All of that stuff was shouted over a river, and they had taken the tour because it was the only way that they could get from whatever part of Palestine they're in to the River Jordan, because tourism is allowed to do that. So as the day went on, and we saw the walls, and the wire, and the checkpoints, and the holy sites, and the stories, it more or less ended at lunch, which was at his place, slightly later in the day. But he had a room at the bottom of his house where there was a small feast prepared. And he had his family out, and he was showing off his kid. He had this like a toddler, a little boy, maybe 2 or 3 years old, that he would carry around in his arm. And I thought his grin was wide beforehand. His grin went, it filled the room. He was so happy, so proud of his child. And we just thought, wow, this guy is so lovely, and he's so proud of his family. He's so incredibly cute as a dad. He made a great dad. And it was a really nice day eating the food. The food was lovely. And the family was great. And we just got to chill and hang out with these people until the bus ride back, which took most of the rest of the day. And we all thought, wow, he's so proud of his family. He's so proud of his son. That's why he keeps showing him around and sort of introducing him to people. And this kid is very confused. Like, who are all these like tall white people like in our house? Like, what do I do with this? And it was really nice. And it took me an unfortunately long amount of time to realize what he was doing. Because by showing us the walls and the checkpoints and the settlements, and seeing that those settlements are in places that the Palestinians are not allowed to be. The walls are stopping Palestinians from leaving. They cannot travel. He is barely allowed out just to do his job. And those checkpoints are strict. This is a guy who has full permissions, and I could see on his face he was worried whether or not those permissions would be honored. And seeing a family, what he was doing was humanizing his family and his people and the Palestinians. He was showing what is happening there without any of the carnage, without any of the pain. He was just saying, we are no longer numbers to you. We are people. And I don't know if he was doing this intentionally. It might have just been a really nice guy, really nice tour guide. But that was the result. He was making us remember Palestine as not statistics, as not broken buildings, but as people, as a toddler who was very confused with all these people around them, as a proud dad whose grin was wider than the room itself, who could not stop laughing and being happy with his family, about the people who made this wonderful food, who showed us around, who were so kind to us. Those people are not statistics to us anymore, nor anyone on that tour, nor anyone who had similar experiences. So I have these memories and I have these experiences, and I see news reports of 6,000 bombs dropping over Gaza in a week. And the West Bank and Gaza are two very different experiences. One is incredibly touristy, maybe not now. The other one is more or less an open-air prison where all the horrors happen. But it's the same governments, it's the same people. And there's been a lot of talk over the past week, more, of Hamas did this terrible thing. We will support Israel to go stop Hamas. And Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas attacked a bunch of civilians. That's not okay. Don't support them. And as a result, you see a lot of both sides. Both sides are the problem here. Hamas is killing civilians of Israel. Israel is killing civilians of Palestine. Both sides are a problem. Except you have to realize the scale that is happening here. It's not two equals fighting against each other. It's Hamas versus Israel. The problem is killing civilians. Never do that. For very obvious reasons. Please. But when you have a both sides argument, you assume that both sides are more or less equal. But Hamas versus Israel is not David versus Goliath, and it's not bad versus good. Both are pretty bad. And when I hear all that, I can't help but think of Sam, a man with a grin wider than his face, who was so proud of his family, who used the money he made from touring and from our tips to feed his family, because there's not many other jobs that he could get. He found workarounds. I think of that, and it's not a statistic, and I don't know what we can do about it. But I thought maybe a story could help. Thank you for watching.